From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Well, Jason, tomorrow I will have been sick for 2 weeks and I'm over it.
I'm over it too.
Yeah.
All that sniffing and...
It's pretty gross.
It is gross.
Yeah.
Even though it's 2 weeks between episodes for our listeners, it's only 2 days between recordings for us, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you haven't been sick for a month.
No, it's been.
But it has been 2 weeks.
It has been 2 weeks. I haven't been working for all of the 2 weeks though, rest assured, listeners. I did take sick days and when I was worse than this.
Yeah. As you should.
As I should, yes.
The business we've proven can run without you, Joelle, at least for a short period of time.
It can limp along.
It can limp along. Not grow dramatically, but we can make do.
It will survive.
Yeah, just don't take any more time off, please.
Thanks.
It's enough. Had enough.
So I might have to see the doctor if it carries on any longer.
Yeah, no, worthwhile. I can't remember if I said it last episode, but my daughter also had sinus issues and ended up being a sinus infection. And it was another week or two on top of the 2 weeks that you've been going through.
Yeah.
Hopefully I wasn't a carrier and gave it to you. That would...
I mean, I don't know where else I would have got it from, Jason, so, you know.
Yeah, we get out and about, right?
Not really.
Public transport.
No.
Can someone be a carrier of a sinus issue and not actually have it?
Well, I think the sinus infection develops as like a secondary infection from
but the
something
sinus
else.
issue, because I haven't had a snotty nose or anything.
Okay.
myself.
Well, you could be a carrier of a virus without exhibiting symptoms of a virus, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So potentially, but let's not rule out other sources.
Well, you know,
of
I've got a
infection.
kid in high school as well. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He'd be carrying heaps of
he's
stuff.
usually a vector, yeah.
Yeah, I reckon. All right. Well, look, this isn't a health show.
No.
Well, not at least not a medical show.
It's not a show about colds and flus, no.
No. So we should probably introduce our guest.
Yes.
All right. So she's a thought leader and executive level expert in psychosocial risk management, safety, and workers' compensation. She advises executive teams and boards on how to create working environments that are not only compliant, but genuinely better for people. She has 3 decades of experience in health, safety, and wellbeing across multiple industries. She is the managing director of Catalyst Safety and Catalyst Coaching. A warm welcome to the podcast, Julia Cohen.
Thank you. And that discussion has just made me feel quite pleased I'm not sitting in the same room.
Well, Julia, I've been in the same room as the past week for most.
No, it's been 2 days this week that I had to drag myself in.
2 days this week, and I had a snotty daughter for 2 weeks as well, and I didn't get sick. So, but look, we are connecting with you from New South Wales, so yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
Although I have had 2 other members of my team down sick who are also from interstate. Maybe the viruses are evolving and being transmitted.
And Julia was just saying there's something weird going on with her maps, and maybe it's turned into a computer virus.
It is. It's a computer to human virus.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Sorry, Julia.
It's beginning. It's beginning.
Yep.
It's the implant.
Julia, what podcasts do you like to listen to?
Depending on how much time we have, I'm a lover of podcasts, but looking through the list of ones that I've been listening to most lately, I love a podcast called Hidden Brain, which has got the lovely voice and the wonderful curiosity of a fellow called Shankar Vedantam, who interviews psychologists in all spheres of psychology and human behaviour, and the amount of things that you pick up from that podcast is really fascinating. I love another one which is from the Freakonomics sort of, I think they call it a brand now, called People I Mostly Admire. an amusing conversation, usually between Stephen Dubner and his co-host Angela Duckworth. And it just ranges around all sorts of topics, interviewing people, again, who are thought leaders in their own specific areas. And as ones that are really not so much connected to thought leadership and so on, there's a beautiful podcast called Dear Daughter, which follows a scripted approach. Runs out of Kenya, interestingly, and features somebody who writes a scripted letter to their daughter, and they get the opportunity to read it and talk about what's going on in that daughter's life, which I think is quite beautiful. And then as a nature lover, and we have commented that there's some whipbirds in the background at the moment, What the Duck, who can resist Anne Jones and her fabulous sense of humour? So that's a few of my favourite ones.
I'm feeling really bad now, Joelle. We asked Julia off air before we started if she'd ever listened to an episode of our podcast.
Yeah.
She spends a lot of time listening to podcasts.
She does.
And she's only listened to one of ours, and she can't even remember which one.
But I promise by midnight tonight I'll have them all done.
Yeah. Often we have long-time listeners, first-time callers. This is like a one-time listener.
Yeah. Well, we have to do a really good job, Jason, and inspire Julia to listen to our back catalogue.
It's now going to be equal. She's listened to as many as she's appeared in.
Yeah. Not many people can say that.
No, 1-to-1.
Well, if I might be able to say in my defence, I've been so busy
listening to other people's podcasts.
Yeah, we get it, Julia. We get it.
So, well, apart from that, working on psychosocial safety, that by the time I come home and want to listen to a podcast, I generally don't choose to listen to podcasts about psychosocial safety, because my days have been very full of that for the last 3 to 5 years.
That's fair. That's why I refuse to take calls from Joelle after hours as well, because I've heard from her all day. But look, Adam Grant never listened to a single one of our episodes. We found out when we interviewed him.
We were shocked and appalled.
Before he joined us on the podcast. So you're doing better than Adam Grant. So
that's actually one of the ones I committed myself to listening to, which I haven't done, but I should do, because, he really is a leading light, isn't he? He's a very, very interesting person and really does have a fabulous brain.
He does have an amazing brain.
Yes, and an amazing grasp of so many research fields and publications out there.
Yeah.
Tell us about your professional career, please.
It's been a bit of a winding track, actually, when I sat down to think about it.
Those are the best ones usually.
After I finished university, some time ago, I started as an early career academic and was really privileged to get involved in some of the seminal research looking at injecting drug use, which led to the establishment of, here in Sydney, the King's Cross Safe Injecting Room, which is work that I'm immensely proud of, and every now and then even see people still cite. And the fact that safe injecting room still exists throughout many government changes is something I think, New South Wales should be proud of, because it was a big step at the time. We're talking about the early 1990s when HIV was a big issue. And then following on from that, I moved more into frontline community care. So I worked with people who had significant mental illness, who were moving out of hospitals and living in the community again. And my role was really to help them reestablish their lives and their jobs. And I loved that job because I got to work one-on-one with people and really have an impact on their life. I left that role because it became financially unsustainable, basically. Frontline community work is not a role that's going to make you wealthy in any way. So I made an active decision to move into more of a corporate role, and that's where my role initially at QBE in workers' compensation started. And I actually did my interview the day after 9/11, so I didn't actually know if QBE was going to still exist a week later because it had such a big impact. But it did, and one of the great advantages of the 10 years I spent working there was I got to complete an MBA, which really changed the direction of my career. I enjoyed every moment of that. And I then was sent into other parts of Australia where there were improvements that were needed. And so got to experience driving some pretty hardcore change. And to this day, I think that's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I retain great respect for people who can undertake, change in a corporate environment and keep people safe and well and healthy through that process, because it is definitely not easy. After a period of time, I decided that I wanted to step away from the insurance side and work on the employer side of the same industry. So I joined the University of Sydney, and in that role, I was also given oversight of safety and wellbeing as well. And apart from the fact that I had already worked at the University of Sydney as a very young researcher, so going back was a delight. I got to see how the university ran from the senior professional and administrative perspective. And I could pretty quickly identify that there really wasn't a culture of safety, and there was a big emphasis on ethics and making sure that participants in all sorts of research were kept safe, but a big black hole when it came to looking after the people doing that research. And that became a bit of a mission for me to change that culture. And I in that role established a united safety, health and wellbeing team, and then moved on to really working very hard with the Senate, which is their board, on supporting a cultural change around how safety was viewed and done. And that really focused in on safety conversations, having the top 3 levels of management who, to their surprise, were quite invisible to the frontline younger researchers and workers, to go into the laboratories, to go into the into the libraries, go into the areas where people were working and have an open safety conversation with them, listen well and hear what was needed. And I think that they quite enjoyed that role. And the other really fantastic advantage there was being able to stand up an overarching wellbeing framework where under the leadership of the wellbeing coordinator, established a group of wellbeing champions. So 40 people per year were trained in how to be a champion in their area. And I think at one time we had 120 active wellbeing champions. And I think that's what really kicked off my understanding of where health and wellbeing intersect. And they're not always quite the same thing. And they're both needed. So that was a fantastic journey. And then after 10 years of I think it probably took about 8 years to turn that culture around, to large organisations that are 200 years old are not going to change quickly. And that was a big learning for me, who's naturally fairly impatient and, would love it if I could just provide here's the evidence, and, people will just follow. And, of course, we know that that's not quite how things work. So from there, I felt that I had done the work that I could do, and it was time to sort of refresh my own career. And having come from that community sector, I had a really strong interest in the not-for-profit sector as well. So I went from Sydney University and then joined as the National Health and Safety General Manager for the Salvation Army, and very quickly learned that where there were 10,000 employees at the University of Sydney, there were 20,000 employees at the Salvation Army and 30,000 volunteers to whom, as an organisation, we owed a safety duty. So the scale of that was a big learning for me. If I thought 10,000 people and the culture there was hard to change, then, in a not-for-profit of a similar age, but with so highly dispersed as well, that was just next level challenge. And then from there, I have now established the Catalyst Collective, as you said in the introduction, looking to really work hard to help boards and executive teams really understand psychosocial risk, coming back to my roots in psychology, and to understand that what's needed to actually have a strategy that is based on evidence but has traction on the ground, and bringing, this is probably the mission I find myself pursuing really hard at the moment, and that is not only helping boards understand and own strategy, but also bringing safety, HR and IR closer together, because whilst everyone's trying to do the right thing at the moment, it's quite siloed.
Yeah, we're definitely observing similar trends, Julia. I'm interested to go into, again, a bit of your background and look at when you were at University of Sydney and then moving to the Salvation Army. Like you said, much bigger scale, maybe less resources as well. But I'm wondering, going from an organisation that would be better resourced like University of Sydney to a large not-for-profit like the Salvation Army, besides the scale, was there any other differences or commonalities that surprised you?
There were, so the commonalities, I guess, not necessarily that surprised me, but I very quickly identified almost the same gap. It was pretty overwhelming at first. When I started with the Salvation Army, we were all in COVID lockdown as well. So the opportunity to really, touch and feel and hear didn't come for a little while. So it made it somewhat more difficult, I think, to understand the organisation. The major difference was the fact that the Salvation Army, as I think the most recognised brand internationally of all brands, is a church-led organisation. So of those 20,000 employees, about 2,000 of them were active church members and leaders, and the influence that they had over strategy, and you're absolutely right, access to budget was always an issue, and quite understandably what was forefront in their minds was their mission, which was that they were there to undertake religious activities, and safety was not really front of mind for them at all. And the added complication, which took a bit to learn about, was that not-for-profits are often funded by government or government subsidiaries, and there are really strict rules about what that funding money can be used for. And safety traditionally had been labelled as an administrative activity, and so therefore the funding wasn't directed towards safety. And that made getting access to budget to create change a really tricky situation.
Yeah, I do recall when you were still there, Julia, having a conversation. You were interested in our risk assessment tool. But, even if I was able to give it to you at a significant not-for-profit discount, it was still out of the realms of possibility. And you really had to rely on free tools like the People at Work survey at the time to do that risk assessment.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there was just no way I was going to get the board and the executive team to agree to that at that point in time. I do hope for them as they mature that they will also be able to see the value in accessing tools that can actually provide some more textured data than People at Work is able to provide.
Yeah, well, we'll have to look at something else soon, seeing as People at Work will be shut down shortly. But yes, it is a challenge for most not-for-profits, right? That not just their understanding and commitment to health and safety amongst the other priorities that they have, but often working on a shoestring budget, right? Even at a massive scale like you're working at.
Absolutely. But there were some good similarities as well. So, at a university, you kind of have two types of employees. You have the academic employees and the professional employees. At the Salvation Army, similarly, you could almost say three types of employees, the people who were professionals in their areas, like myself, all the way down to the front line. People who were members of the church, or in their language, there were also what they call adherents, so people who would attend church but didn't have official roles. And then, they started as a volunteer army, and they are still very heavily staffed by volunteers. And being able to reach volunteers and have them brought into a safety system, be it for physical hazards or psychosocial hazards, is quite difficult. The experience that I'd had understanding that difference at the University of Sydney actually stood me in good stead to understand that direct access to people right at the front line was absolutely essential to success.
So what were the main psychosocial challenges that you identified at the Salvation Army?
So it's probably helpful to sort of get an understanding of what the Salvation Army in Australia do. They're known as a territory. They have a head office. They work in areas such as family and domestic violence. They work with youth at risk. They work with people with alcohol and other drug issues, including providing accommodation for that. They provide homelessness support and accommodation, again, in that area. And then there are some more sort of enterprise-based parts of the Salvation Army. So I think everyone knows Salvo Stores, but they also had Employment Plus, which was a government job seeker support business designed to provide revenue into the core of the Salvation Army. They had Salvo Funerals, and they had a national network, or have a national network of aged care facilities. So thinking about all of that kind of work, it's such a broad risk profile. But they're thinking about the kind of psychosocial risks that were the most commonly experienced ones across all of those different types of ways of working and working disciplines. There was by far the most prominent one was exposure to either verbal or physical violence. exposure to other people's trauma, vicarious trauma, which is a difficult psychosocial risk to work with. The manager-employee relationship risk was often quite present. There was still very much a culture of promoting people who had had longer tenure than other people and not necessarily any leadership training of any kind. And that actually had an impact on the vicarious trauma mitigations, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. Just the physical environment. Some of the buildings were really, struggling. They just were quite run down. And if you're physically not feeling safe, then you're not psychologically going to be feeling the greatest either. And finally, role clarity. There was a lot of blurring of roles because of that large profile and a very devolved structure. So when I say that, I mean there were over 2,400 sites. So that enables a lot of subcultures to grow.
Yeah. Something that we often, or I guess a common conversation that we have, and in particular with boards and executives, is there's this real perception that people go into jobs knowing what's involved in the job, and so it almost kind of comes along with this expectation that people will just have to deal with any psychosocial hazards that are present in the job, and that if they if they weren't willing to be exposed to those hazards, they shouldn't have gone into the job at all. And I would expect that when you're talking about a volunteer workforce, that kind of a perception would be magnified even more so than with somebody that you're actually, paying to work for you.
I think that actually the people who were most exposed to that sort of, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen sort of attitude were the case managers working with people in distress and trouble. I think there was an expectation and a culture of, and this often happens in deeply values-driven organisations. They don't have to be not-for-profits. Reflecting back to the University of Sydney, for an academic, often their role is a calling. They really do feel called to do it. There was this sort of sense at the Salvation Army that that case managers would know what they were coming into and that they would have it within themselves to sort of deal with that. And I think that and if they couldn't, then it was kind of time to leave, that there was just this gap in understanding of the fact that risk that people who are dealing with distressed other people 5 days a week is a risk that can be addressed and mitigated.
Yeah, definitely. And, if your job is to lift and carry heavy items from one place to another place, nobody expects that you're just going to be able to manage that okay. And they do actually, as an employer, recognise that they need to do whatever they can to reduce the physical demands of that job. A scaffolder is going to be working at height, but you still need to provide fall protection. So it's the same kind of principles that apply, but it doesn't seem to translate very easily.
And I think for a lot of not-for-profits, there's a little bit of a gap in knowledge even around something as clear and obvious to those of us who, understand safety really well. Even things like working at heights was not really seen as a risk because the highest things that had to be dealt with, there was plenty of working at heights because churches tend to have really high ceilings. And if a light globe goes out or a speaker malfunctions, they felt it was just natural that they would climb up on a very tall ladder and fix that because they were in, that church was the seat of, their core mission. And it's sort of, slipped through the cracks that there's actually safety protocols around how you actually access things at height. So I think that's quite common in not-for-profits still, that actually even something that we would think of as obvious is still probably less mature in that sector than elsewhere.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. So, Julia, you described obviously moving into Salvation Army was quite a challenge to get around, the scale and complexity and, like you say, so many, over 2,000 sites and all the rest. So can you take us through briefly, I guess, a bit of the process that you followed in relation to bringing psychosocial safety into the Salvos?
Yes, it was. It was a challenging conversation to start. So one of my observations right from the get-go was that they had a newly written and quite elegant safety management system that was mapped out quite well. And they were basically trying to boil the ocean. They were trying to address absolutely everything that was mapped out on this system. And they were using audit as the measure of whether or not they were being successful in doing that. So they were taking a fairly, if you like, sort of the old 4801 kind of approach to understanding safety. And then the idea that psychosocial risk codes of practice and regulations were coming hot on the heels of, we knew they were coming. We knew that within a year we were going to start seeing them being published, was something that certainly the executive level were finding quite difficult to understand. So in order to sort of prevent the let's try and address absolutely everything all at once and right now, and then get, some auditors in and go from one end of the country to another, I introduced a critical risk identification program first. And what that involved was actually getting around the country and visiting as many different types of services and locations as possible. So making sure that we got out to really remote places like Kalgoorlie, I think Kununurra, really places where people had to be very self-sufficient. Regional areas like country Victoria, and then city-based services as well. And all of those service types that I mentioned before, making sure that there was a fairly good and even mix of those that we visited as well. And the purpose of those visits was to have an open conversation, really, that only had 3 questions that we wanted to ask. So I went to every one of them, and then the local safety people and the local manager would be part of that as well. But we also went and stood with frontline workers in Salvo stores, distribution centres, for example. And the basic 3 questions were, talk to us about your daily work. And for the manager, how do you keep yourself and your people safe on a daily basis? Second question is, what do you worry about? What do you think you're unable to do? What do you feel like is missing that the executive of because the executive are rarely seen out on the front lines just because of distance. What do they need to know that you think's missing? And then the real zinger question was from me, which was, if I rang you at 11 o'clock tonight and said, I've got some awful news, someone has actually died in your service or location as a result of the work they're doing, tell me what you think it is. Like, what pops straight into your head that has killed them? And I can tell you, every single local manager that I asked that question to could instantly tell me what might kill someone. And I'm really confident that if we'd asked them, tell us about your worst risk, they would have struggled to answer that question. But by asking it the way we did, we really tried very hard to bypass very technical questions. And we took all that data, gathered it all together. And then as the codes of practice for psychosocial risks started to become enacted across Australia, we also started to sort of put in a few prompts around those risks as well, like how psychologically healthy do you feel people are when they're working, and what from that front do you worry about? Amalgamated the data and came out with, I think, 14 commonly experienced critical risks. So we wrapped the psychosocial information into the critical risk program. And as you mentioned before, we also then, and with the help of ICARE New South Wales, we rolled out the People at Work survey across all employees, and we invited volunteers, which I later learned was the first time volunteers had been asked to add their voice to a survey. But, coming from a safety mindset, we owe them a duty, so we want to hear from them. And it was absolutely essential that those conversations were had at the front line, and that the survey and the survey results were wrapped into a strategy that the board felt really comfortable with, which was to understand what those critical risks were. So it didn't become something different. It wasn't an add-on, and it didn't mean more work.
I think that aligns to Joelle's next question, actually.
Yeah, so that's around so you've done all of that research, you've collected information about psychosocial hazards and risk. How do you then translate that into a strategy and an action plan that's palatable for that senior leader group?
Yeah, and again, it's not an easy one. You as is very common, even if you're part of the leadership team yourself, as I was, you do still have to influence without very much authority. So for me, I found it really important to stay up to date with current thinking. And, there was so much evidence coming out of either the regulators or the universities, or people like Adam Grant or people like Timothy Clark, who have a maturity model around psychological safety. And even at the team level, the Amy Edmondson sort of work. And first step was to educate and establish a common language around psychosocial risk management and psychological safety, because technically they're not really the same thing, but often the words can be used interchangeably. And to help the organisation, and when I say the organisation, I am talking about the executive team, understand that the term psychosocial risk is actually an umbrella term for 14, well, it's actually 12 plus harassment and bullying and sexual harassment, help them understand that that umbrella term actually covers 14 quite distinct, different risks that have formal definitions. And once the language started to gel, then the palatability, if you like, of the strategy, which was, as I said, really headlined as a critical risk strategy, but we had the people at work survey results, which we could wrap into that and also talk to them about separately. So the next step was actually, and I might be jumping forward a little bit here, but the next step was actually, okay, we know what those 14 commonly experienced critical risks are, both the physical and the psychosocial ones. What do we do with this information? Well, in accordance with any risk management process, you measure, you identify, then measure, and then you do your analysis. So what we did is called in those people from the front line, from wherever they were, and depending on what risks were relevant to them, we invited them into critical risk analysis workshops. And we used the bow tie method because it's a really nice visual method and really nice method to use with a group of people. They really enjoyed that because that kind of consultation was something that I don't think they had experienced a lot of before. And then to make it understood by the executive team, I developed 2 workshops to pretty much take them through the same process, and then added their views on what they thought from a bow tie analysis were the causes and the consequences, and how both, the causes could be prevented and the consequences mitigated. So they actually got to sort of see, hear, feel, taste the same things that those from the front line were experiencing and also analysing. And then all that data was then brought together to, then have some discussions about mitigations, which were also often not easy discussions to have. But at least they had a visual representation and a common language to start to talk about things that they really hadn't had that kind of meaningful contact with before. They used to talk about safety, and they could talk about psychosocial safety, but they didn't really have anything deeper than that. And this gave them a deeper understanding of really what was needed.
Yeah, and that's really kind of talking then about your systems of work as control measures as well, rather than just controlling the hazard at the point in time that you're interacting with it. So it's a very kind of a conceptual shift around how those things can be managed.
Yeah, that's right. And what was really pleasing is, because budget is so limited, that those local areas that had those frontline people they really led the executives rather than the other way around, because they were willing to spend some budget to send somebody to Sydney or Melbourne, which is where the 2 head offices were, because they were really excited to remain involved in, the thinking, the analysis, and then obviously implementation of what came out as feasible. Also, it's a really strong belief of mine that if me and my team had have sat in the office in Sydney and taken that data and then said, okay, well, here's some great mitigations, we would inevitably have got those systems of work wrong, because we don't know really what happens day in, day out for those people trying to work quite a long way away from head office. We needed their intelligence and their knowledge of, that's never going to work, that's never going to fly, or I've got this other idea, And that's sort of like Timothy Clark's contributor safety sort of level. So it was taking the culture up a bit of a notch as well. And they really enjoyed the process. Bow tie analyses can be quite fun because they are very visual and interactive. It's not to say that every mitigation that the frontline or myself wanted was funded and that it, turned everything round on a 20-cent piece. I wish it could have. But I think the fact that the frontline was so engaged, we had an executive team who really were quite intrigued by that level of enthusiasm, and they followed suit. They said, well, if they can do it, we want to do it too. And I think that's a really nice little cultural shift that happened there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, really interesting and great to hear you talk that through. By the way, you are a real safety nerd, aren't you, Julia? Like bow ties are fun.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't say bow ties themselves are fun, but when you've got 20 people in a room all, with big, thick coloured textures, it can become quite fun. It actually can be.
I'll take your word for it.
But yeah, okay, I'll take it. I'm a nerd.
It's, most of our listeners, do like the nerdy stuff, so that's fine. So, Julia, I guess many of our listeners would be aware that Comcare added fatigue as another psychosocial hazard on top of the 14 from the model codes of practice. And recently, Tasmania and New South Wales adopted the model code of practice for fatigue at work. So this is separate to considering fatigue as a psychosocial hazard and thinking about fatigue and its management on its own. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how fatigue interacts with psychosocial risks and physical hazards?
I think it's one of the best moves that has happened in the here's the nerd coming out again. I'll be honest, initially when I saw another code of practice has been, released, I went, oh God, do we need another one? But I actually think it's a really well written, that the one that was published right at the end of last year is really well described and written. It's written in plain English, in plain language, and spells out very clearly what the health effects of fatigue are in terms of people's health, and breaks it into the tasks and environment, cognitive capability, and emotional issues, and talks quite clearly about the fact that somebody who is fatigued, and they explain in the code, they mean fatigued, not just tired, but fatigued to the point where they're impaired. And there is some information in the code about what level of fatigue sort of equates to blood alcohol concentrations. They talk about the fact that physically people can become just less able to recognise a simple slip, trip and fall hazard or follow a procedure just because they're fatigued. And that puts them at more risk of hazard turning into an incident or injury and leading to harm. Then they talk about the cognitive load and the fact that a really fatigued person just really can't concentrate and think as clearly as somebody whose role isn't fatiguing them as much. And then the emotional part, they talk about emotional regulation. So a really fatigued person will find it much more difficult to really emotionally engage at work, and also potentially will find it very difficult to be empathic and to have positive relationships because they're just too fatigued to, for those executive functions to work so well. So I think it's a really nice sort of nexus between not dissimilar to, critical risks. Psychosocial risks have actually always been there, and there's always been a duty to look out for them, but they were never sort of described before. This sort of brings it together in a really nice way. I think they've done a really good job with that, and I think that it may be easier to understand than just looking at psychosocial risks alone, because, like I said before, I think the worst thing that could happen is that physical risks and psychosocial risks are kept sort of like separate things. They need to be understood in the whole system of work, as you said before.
Yeah. It's a really good observation. I mean, the same goes for musculoskeletal disorders as well, cardiovascular diseases. They all have a relationship with psychosocial hazard exposure. But I cut my teeth on fatigue risk management going back to 2007. That's when I first got interested in health and safety and involved. So that was a year after the Code of Practice came out in WA, which is the first Code of Practice for working hours. And I think there's some really great learnings from how companies have to learn how to deal with fatigue. Something that's invisible, differs greatly from person to person, has that direct health effect, but also that interrelationship with being able to less perceive hazards and respond more intensely to hazard exposure as well at an individual level. And then really thinking about the shared responsibility, going, it's not just about the individual practicing better self-care, in the case of fatigue, getting better sleep, but it's also about what can the organisation do, what are the systems and structures to prevent the person getting fatigued. And obviously things like working hours, breaks, time of work, rest periods, and commuting, all those sorts of things are important.
I think the big ones for me in that are, and this is where I think that gets quite exciting for a nerd like me, is the role design. Role design is such a strong mitigator for psychosocial risk. And this is where my sort of mission around bringing safety and HR closer together, and the front line, because what I think is quite interesting is when you start talking in a risk discussion to an HR person, I'm being very general here, but I think what they hear is organisational design, which is a huge piece of work. But role design, as you were sort of hinting at before, is something quite different. And my personal view is very similar to who will understand what mitigators will work the best. Well, who also understands how the role is best designed so that it doesn't fatigue them? Well, it's, in my view, the person who does that role all day, every day. So they really need to be brought into discussions about, can we design this role better? And the other thing that sort of sits there as its little twin is shift design. So, and that's what you're saying about, start times, finish times, and so on. It's an opportunity to look at how to design the shift patterns so that, again, they don't create fatigue. It's a really nice meeting of minds, I reckon.
Yeah, I agree. And we've had, some really great experts like Sir Kerry Cooper on before that really highlighted the need to consult with workers because they're going to be the best judges of, their experience of work and how it could be modified to improve. My only caution to listeners would be to think about the incentives that workers might have to accept conditions that might be unsafe. So you hear about things like danger pay, for example, so being more willing to do dangerous jobs if they're paid more. I remember back in the day when, 2-and-1 rosters were the norm here in WA, in mining, and some people still wanted to do 3-and-1 or 4-and-1 because the pay was better. So they will, put aside the fatigue risks and the health impacts for better pay. And the same with psychosocial, right? Like people might be more willing to take on more stressful positions and work that ultimately might harm their health. Again, if they feel like it's good for their immediate pay or it's good for their career. So, we have to maybe run that through a kind of rule and what does the evidence say about what is healthy or not just not just like I think the employees are a great source of information about how to make things safe, but we also need to run that through a bit of the evidence base as well.
Yeah, also, if we're looking at things like overtime and like shift coverage for like absenteeism and that kind of thing, right? And we see this a lot in healthcare, aged care, those types of sectors where people will put up their hand to do a second shift because it gives them the overtime pay. And again, there's that kind of perception from the employer that, well, they've volunteered themselves for it. We're not forcing them to do it. So therefore we're okay. But actually, no, you still actually need to risk assess the fatigue impacts of having that person work that shift or cover that shift and make a call, and have some rules around actually when do we say, no, you can't actually work anymore today or this week or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that's very prominent in the aged care sector and the emergency first responder sector, because there's just simply not enough, there's very strong limits on resourcing at the moment. But I totally agree that it has to work within the organisational design model, but I think it's a really palatable way of having a discussion about, does this really work? And I know that I experienced the same, probably about the same time, Jason, as you were talking about. I used to work with Tomago Aluminium just north of Newcastle. And similarly, they were sort of still stuck in the number of days since lost time injury and 12-hour shifts for 7 straight days, then 5 days off. And, people would stick up their hand because they earn significant amounts more by doing a couple of double shifts. But, and then there was a serious injury. So, it's, but I do remember that, I always shuddered when I saw that number of days since lost time injury sign as I was entering the plant.
Yeah, I've seen plenty of them in my past as well.
Yes.
Not as prominent anymore.
Wow. Yeah. So look, Julia, looking back over your time with the Salvation Army, is there anything that you would do differently if you had your time there over again?
I think that we landed on the right strategy, but later than I would have done it. I think that if I did that again, I would go straight for a critical risk strategy and wrap all of the things we've just talked about into that, even if it used different survey tools or different observational or even inspection tools. But I would do that a lot earlier. It was tricky at the time because for that first 6 months we were all in lockdown. So it literally wasn't possible to get out and about for quite some time. But I think that, when I think back on that, I would have done that a lot earlier. The other one is that, and something we haven't talked about today yet, but something that I think, and it still sits in my mind, is that for somewhere like the Salvation Army or anywhere where you've got health workers or case workers who are exposed to people who are unwell, distressed, or in severe distress and trauma, and their job is to hear those people speak, and they may see 5 people a day. I think the role of professional supervision is seen as a really expensive nice to have at the moment, as opposed to an essential mitigator of harm and ill health due to vicarious trauma. And that's one other thing when I think back that recommendation got stuck on a cost conversation. I don't claim to have the perfect answer to that yet, but I think, going into the deep end of the ocean around some of those things earlier would have been better.
Well, Julia, you wouldn't know this because you don't listen to the podcast an awful lot, but we ask our guests the same question at the end of each episode, right? So the question I want you to think about now is, what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
When I was thinking about this question, this was probably one of the questions I found the hardest to sort of really think clearly about. But I think one is this mission I've taken on, which is to bring the disciplines around psychosocial risk and psychological health together. And, I'm referring to the skill sets that sit within a safety, an HR, and our workplace relations team or teams. I'd love to see a common language and an equivalent level of understanding of what the risk management and regulatory requirements are, as well as how are we going to handle that. And, I saw an article online less than 2 days ago that talked about psychosocial risk management, but really what it was describing was a single person investigation of a disagreement between a manager and a staff member. So I think, I'd love to see that conversation getting a bit richer, and I'd love to see that collaboration occur between those three really key disciplines, which means that I think the other part of that risk is within organisations, I'd love to see many more strong sponsors for safety. Often it's left to the poor director of safety or safety manager, depending on the size of the organisation, to try and enact change and influence, but have no authority to do that. And sponsorship from an executive team member is so important. So I'd love to see, more risk-informed sponsors out there. And they're coming. You do hear it in some board discussions, but you also don't hear it in a lot of board discussions. So I think they're the two main ones. And maybe the most controversial hope that I have is the way that the regulators are managing adherence to the codes of practice. There are now psychosocial specialist inspectors, and I have a concern that that's pushing us back towards the old AS 4801 thinking, which is we better write a policy and get it, onto the intranet quickly in case an inspector turns up. And I'm concerned that it means that we're going to spend a lot of energy writing some probably really good documents, but is there time and space to implement them, and are the right people contributing to them? So, I hope the regulators sort of don't push the inspection part so far, and maybe provide, hands-on support so that organisations who don't really understand it yet have that regulator support to get it right before they come in with improvement notices or worse. And we know that there's now been 2 prosecutions under 2 different psychosocial codes of practice. So the gate's open now. So, I just hope the regulators are ready to help businesses, especially medium-sized businesses across Australia, to be prepared, because they can add a lot of value.
Oh, I think they're all worthy hopes for the future.
Definitely.
So HR, safety, working better together, executive endorsement in particular, and regulators not pushing companies to become paper safe without actually, thinking about how these policies and procedures are actually implemented.
Yeah. And I think it's not just endorsement. I think it's actually active sponsorship that is needed.
Yeah.
All right, final question for you, Julia. What parting words of advice do you have for listeners who are interested in working in psychosocial safety?
I will repeat my mission. I really urge safety and HR professionals to really have a think about how they can take their skill sets, bring them together and share information so that when there is harm or where there is need for investment in preventative and mitigating controls, that there is that shared understanding of why that's important from a compliance perspective, and also why it helps the employees of an organisation actually feel safer in the workplace, because they know that there is a team of people with a variety of skill sets there ready to help them. And then the other one is, I'd love to see some more maturity around understanding role design. I think that'd be a wonderful discussion to start hearing. That would give our HR colleagues an awful lot of ability to understand the work that's being done whilst they're helping the organisation design itself as a whole. But if there is a building level of maturity in role design, that's going to enhance the skill set of any safety practitioner as well. And it's going to bring, I think it's going to open up discussions about, workplaces where people can turn up in the morning, can work really hard, and when they leave at the end of the day or shift, they're actually feeling a bit better about themselves than they did in the morning because they've done something, valuable, and they're not fatigued.
Yeah, so that's around, I guess, the ability to make some more sort of localised and change that's going to have a more immediate impact, I guess, while the longer term OD stuff is going on. Yeah.
Yeah, because they fit together really nicely.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, Julia, it's been a fascinating conversation with someone as experienced as you. We definitely could sense all 3 decades or so of your work in this conversation. So
I don't look that tired, do I?
No, it was more to do with the quality of information that you gave, Julia, rather than how fatigued you might be. No, but really appreciate it. I know our listeners are really going to get a lot of great insights from the experience that you're able to share with us today. So thanks for coming on the pod.
Oh, look, thank you for inviting me. I know that we've had many interesting discussion. And I also, want to express some gratitude for the University of Sydney way back when they were prepared to fund, I think, the first ever true wellbeing framework that brought people from the organisation into a strategic approach. The amount I learnt just from that really, it grew from there. It was a really valuable experience. And I think if I hadn't have had that knowledge, making that full transformation would have been almost impossible. And then approaching it somewhere as big as the Salvation Army, I think would have just been impossible. But I'm very grateful for what I've learned in those couple of decades.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for sharing. So, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video when we have our guests on, and you can catch all of our previous videos on the Flourish GX YouTube channel. We also take the snippets of these discussions and put them on the Flourish GX LinkedIn page. So go over there to get some of the highlights. And while you're on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with Joelle or myself or Julia if you want to continue the conversation. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.